Now we're going to talk about organizational fraud. So this is chapter 14. So this is when employees, vendors, customers commit fraud against an organization. All right, so moving on. This fraud is huge. This is a fraud that it's entirely possible you've even already come across someplace where you worked. People just, as simple as stealing some of the inventory. That would be an occupational fraud. But the median losses are 150,000. It's estimated 5% of revenues get lost to fraud. So it's a huge, huge problem. They can be tough to detect because the people who are committing them are being trusted at that organization. And they're hard to catch. They're just little things. They're not material that an auditor would notice, something like that. Most likely way of catching these frauds is whistleblowers. So that's why it's important to have that whistleblower tool available at organizations. Now, the good news is when we implement anti-fraud controls, it significantly lowers the losses. So we're going to also learn a little bit as we go along about how to prevent frauds, right? So the title of this book in this class is Fraud Investigation, and that's not so much about preventing, but having those whistleblower hotlines, having controls in place, having internal auditors, all these can help prevent frauds, which saves you all the money that would have been stolen. If a fraud occurs, you're not necessarily going to get it all back. Mostly small organizations, right? They're not going to have the controls. They're not going to have internal auditors. But when these frauds occur, it's going to have a big devastating effect on these organizations. Some organizations have actually gone out of business because of employee fraud. The loss gets bigger when people higher up the organization do the fraud, right? So the owners and executives, owners sometimes steal from their own companies. And so it's higher when the higher ups do the fraud. So there are several kinds of organizational frauds that we're going to talk about, right? The first kind, and I would say the most common kind, are what we'd call asset misappropriations. So that's when somebody, employees, vendors, customers, somebody, now we're not talking about somebody coming in with a gun and robbing you, all right? That's not fraud, right? But they, employees, vendors, and customers can steal the assets. Not always cash, but they can steal when it's received, they can steal it when it's on hand, and they can commit some kind of disbursement fraud, have cash paid out to them, or have product sent to them. Like our SAP assignment 2. An employee had some bicycles sent to them. So you're going to take various forms, and we're going to learn these various forms. And of course, in each of these asset misappropriation scenarios, people might do it by themselves, or they may have to work in collusion with somebody else, depending on what controls are in place, right? The better controls, the more segregation of duties, the more people they have to get involved, the more likely to get caught. So in your book, there's a couple of different taxonomies or groupings of occupational fraud. The first one lists asset misappropriations, and it's by how they steal them, right? Are they stealing receipts? Are they stealing assets on hand? And are they dispersing them to themselves? Is an employee by themselves, or is there a collusion with a customer or a collusion with a vendor on disbursement frauds? So that's one way of categorizing them. And the reason we categorize them is So we can talk about ways to prevent them, ways to detect them, and have a common set of tools to apply in this situation. There's a second kind of classification by Mr. Wells, who's a pretty important in fraud examination. He kind of came up with a lot of the concepts and has a lot of books on it. And he categorizes them, asset misappropriations, by whether it's theft of cash or theft of something else, not when it's being stolen. Is it a theft of cash or is it something else? Inventory being probably the second most common. And if it's cash, is it larceny, is it a disbursement, or is it skimming? And if it's inventory and other assets, is it just being misused, or is it larceny, which is taking it? All right, so when we come back for our next visit, our next video, we will talk about these various kinds of thefts.